Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming to the final panel of today's day, the final panel of the summit as well. I'm Daniela Gilbert. I lead the Redefining Public Safety Initiative at the Vera Institute of Justice, and I'd like to welcome you to this panel, which is focused on restoration, the ways that restored communities acknowledge and address the racial disparities impacting Black communities, Indigenous communities, and other communities of color. We're hoping to cover the policies, programs, and investments that are necessary to address racial inequities and heal communities of color. I'd like to first introduce our moderator, who will then, all the panelists will introduce themselves following. Ed Chung is the VP of Initiatives at the Vera Institute of Justice and has 2 decades of legal and policy-making experience, including positions in the White House Domestic Policy Council and the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee. Prior to joining Vera, he was the Vice President of Criminal Justice Reform at the Center for American Progress and also worked on some of the Obama administration's signature priorities, including the My Brother's Keeper initiative, the Task Force on 21st Century Policing, and ending the criminalization of poverty. Ed started his career as an assistant district attorney here in Manhattan, then as a federal prosecutor in the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division. He received a BA from Boston College and a JD from the Georgetown University Law Center.
Hey everyone. Oh, you don't need to applaud. No need. I get so awkward when somebody reads the bio because it's supposed to be like whatever, but I actually have, the folks on this panel actually have bios that are worth applauding, and so I'm really privileged to moderate this panel. We want to make this much more of a conversation style. You all come to this not only to receive information, but hopefully to participate. So I want you to get your questions ready. We're going to set the table for you all here by helping for you all to get some just base information to ground us together, but then we just want to have a discussion. And this, I think, to wrap up a summit, this is one of the best ways that I like to do it, especially on such, a light topic like racial disparities in the system and in public safety. But I'm gonna just toss it to each of the panelists with an opening question, ask them to introduce themselves, and then just with an opening question, because this is when we have your highest level of attention. So the opening question after you introduce yourself is, don't bury the lead. What is the one takeaway that you want this group to have after this session? And part B, you can answer it this way too. Is there a misconception about racial disparities, either in the criminal legal system or in public safety, that you want to dispel at this point? So we'll start to my immediate left with Khalil Muhammad. Khalil, please.
Thanks everybody for coming, and it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm honored to be here with my fellow panelists. I am Khalil Gibran Muhammad. I am Professor of History, Race, and Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, author of The Condemnation of Blackness, and as of late, the co-host of a podcast called Some of My Best Friends Are, which I try to hold court on some important themes that are resonant with today's conference. So Ed, you asked a pretty direct question. From my vantage point as a historian, there's one significant period in recent American history, and by that I mean over the last 100 years, that bears a clear historical lesson, which is that attempting to lock up poor people who are engaging in a range of behaviors, some of which are non-criminal, but they are criminalized, for the purposes of trying to survive in a capitalist society, failed miserably. It was called the Prohibition era. And what's remarkable about the Prohibition era is if we imagine how hard a lift it is today in the federal government to get something like the George Floyd and Policing Act passed in the wake of what happened two years ago, imagine how much harder it is to get a constitutional amendment. They got not one constitutional amendment to save white America from itself, but 2. The first one was the Volstead Act to criminalize alcohol distribution. The second was to repeal the Volstead Act. So in that lesson, we learn a lot about the consciousness of a nation who recognizes the limits of the criminal legal system as an instrument to deliver well-being and safety. And yet, mysteriously, for much of the rest of the 20th century, even within our communities, and by that I mean most people in this room are people of color, and if not proximate as allies of one kind or another, were kind of on the wrong side of this issue. Well through the 1990s, and I would argue even up until the election of President Barack Obama, was significant ambivalence, if not outright complicity, in holding the line on punitiveness as an appropriate response to, again, poverty, divestment, systemic and structural racism. So we certainly have a messaging problem, to be sure, but we also have a consciousness problem. And as far as I'm concerned, if we don't get the educational piece of this right in terms of what people who are most impacted by this system understand about how this system came to be, how it functions, and what its limitations are, we're going to keep functioning at the margins. Because the one thing white people understand is political currency. You can't lock up an entire white community anywhere in this country, no matter what their social problems are. It's not going to happen, because the natural relationship between voters and the ability to say, listen, if this many people are high on heroin, meth, opioid, crack, you name it, committing acts of domestic violence, property crimes, you name it, then we have a social and structural problem that we need to address. And we are bearing witness to that public health response to this system. So I just want to keep reminding us that these are not abstractions in terms of what alternatives look like. They're already happening in the world. They already exist in the world, and they are already old and enduring. So I don't know how we move our elected officials like Mayor Adams, unlike some of the others that we just heard from downstairs, to fix it in this city, but he's not alone. And of course, at the state level, this problem is even more problematic. But yes, we know what it looks like to decriminalize. We know what it looks like to invest in social policy, in a public health infrastructure that would address the underlying needs of people when it comes to violence, crime, and poverty.
Thanks, Khalil. Frankie?
You're supposed to include the bio also?
Yeah, if you could just give a little bit about yourself, and yeah, please.
Good afternoon or good morning, everyone. I'm Frankie Guzman. I'm an attorney at the National Center for Youth Law in Oakland. I lead our youth justice policy work nationally, but I'm primarily focused in California and Colorado, with the very generous and helpful support from the Public Welfare Foundation. Thank you very much. I'm kind of joking, but serious. And I also just want to share the reason why I got into this work is because, as a young boy, I was 3 years old. My older brother, Freddie, was arrested for the crime of murder. He was 16, was tried as an adult, and given a life sentence, never to come home. And it really, it broke my heart, my family, and set me on the wrong path before I myself became gang involved for all of my adolescent life. And at 15, was arrested for armed robbery, given a 15-year sentence. This was my first offense, given the maximum, and sent to youth prison, only to be made worse. And being in that system, with 11,000 young people in a system with design capacity for only 6,000, it was a very toxic, dangerous, developmentally harmful environment. And so when I got out, I had way more challenges than I came in with, but I also recognized that most of the young people there were Black, brown, Latino and Native American, poor white kids, and Asian Pacific Islander kids. And most of them were bouncing off the walls, looking for love and attention, and instead all we got was, I think, neglect and abuse, and just hearing the judge at sentencing telling me, if you're as good as people say you are, with all this community support, then you're going to go to youth prison, and you're going to come back much improved. And I thought it was a sick joke once I got there, but it made me really angry, and seeing most of my peers who got out of there die or go to prison for life, I felt very hopeless. But for me, my response was not to continue to go down the path most traveled, but instead to do the thing that no one else was doing and go to community college. And I was just so stunned to find people that looked like me in suits with degrees welcoming me with not questions, criminogenic questions like, what have you done and where are you from, meaning what gang, but instead, what do you want to do with your life and how can we help you to do it? And it made me afraid at first and uncomfortable because I had never been the object of somebody's positive interest and investment. But I leaned in, and over time I was inspired to continue on. I went to UC Berkeley. I got a BA in English, but I consider that to be white studies. And at that time, you know, my mentality very much from a gangbang culture was know my enemy. And I wanted to understand why folks that were, you know, the school administrators that were that were kicking us out of school, and the doctors that were letting us die, and the police and judges that were locking us up overwhelmingly. And over time, I learned to be an intermediary of sorts, a facilitator of conversation between those that have and those that have not, and went to UCLA Law School and focused on changing policies. And eventually, I've helped write and pass, in collaboration with community, 23 different laws in California, including ending life without parole for juveniles and youth offender parole for people who have long since been in prison for crimes they committed as youth. And one of those that came home in 2018 was my brother Freddie. After 33 years, you know, and so in a nutshell, like that's what I do and why I do it. But not to the question, you know, and it goes along with what I just described, which is I think a big misconception is that, you know, the criminal justice system is a black-white issue, and it is not. You know, you can go to many counties in California and see not one black or white person in any facility. It'll all be native-looking people, children. And I will also say another misconception is that data means anything, and it doesn't. Data only means, you know, what you're collecting, the way you ask the question, and how you document the data. I work in Colorado, and police and prosecutors will tell you a lot of the white kids that we have in our system in numbers are actually Latino or Native kids. And we know it because we do not prosecute white kids here. Those 6 kids last year that we have as direct files were not white. They were Latino, all of them. And they say because they allow police to document their subjective belief about what the young person's race is, because they believe to ask the young person is to be racially insensitive. And so to spare us that indignation, the cops just get to, you know, mark as white, and it inflates white numbers and it deflates brown numbers. And so, you know, I'm just going to say that most of the time we're undercounted. You know, it's a product of erasure. And I'll just say, you know, one last thing is the misconception that, you know, to be, you know, Latino or Hispanic or Native American Indian is confusing to many of us. Most of us don't know what to do with that. It's a social construct that was created by the colonizer to erase us, right? Like folks that were American Indian here, we don't talk about, we don't acknowledge. We pretend that they only existed in the 1800s and before, but that is a part of the genocidal campaign that is ongoing. And others of us, Mexicans and Puerto Ricans in particular, who are in fact U.S. Americans, were absorbed into this broader category of Hispanic or Latino, and thereby there's this separation between one people, and now we don't know what to do with that. And so when asked, like, you know, how do I identify? I just say I'm indigenous, and I don't identify with Latin. I'm not from any Latin country. I'm not from Spain. I will not share my identity with my colonizer, but I do what I can to try to create unity with our native folks and anybody. I would imagine many of you in this room also have indigenous blood, and so I identify with our community in that way. And so that would be the misconception. It really is like, you know, that genocide isn't still happening, that data means something, and it is a tool for genocide and erasure. And the criminal justice system affects all of us. We just don't know it. And I think we need to push harder to make sure that we respect people's self-identification and self-determination to be recognized and to be viewed as people.
Thanks, Frankie. Please, Jami.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jami Hodge, and I think I'll sort of tie my bio into the first question, which is what I hope people will leave with. So my background, so I'm originally from Detroit. I grew up, you know, in the city, lower socioeconomic status, first in my family to go to college, first to go to law school. And early in my career, had a mentor who suggested going into the prosecutor's office in DC. And really, with the idea, because by that point I already had cousins who were incarcerated. As a young prosecutor, my own brother was incarcerated. And it's only been in this past year that I recognize that I'm also a survivor of violence, which is a whole nother conversation we could have separately, and how many Black people don't acknowledge that we are survivors of violence. And so I went into the role very much with eyes open, knowing that the system causes a lot of harm, but thinking it was important that power holders be people who understand the harm the system causes and still believe prosecutors are some of the most powerful actors in the system. They can stop justice involvement at the point of arrest if they choose to. But what I'll say is, I did that work, and I do think made some difference, some. But I also did a lot of harm because the tools that prosecutors are given essentially are to prosecute and punish. And so that's something I've had to reckon with in my own journey. But what it led me to was when I had a chance to leave, going to the Vera Institute to found and lead a program, Reshaping Prosecution, that worked with prosecutors elected on platforms of change. And for me, that was an opportunity to do something instead of a case-by-case approach, but to impact jurisdictions by changing policy change. But what that work showed me, and really the deep dive, and I'm so grateful just for this entire panel, but I have to acknowledge Khalil and the work that he does, because I think the role of history in understanding these issues is the primary lens. Like, if we don't understand that history and the intentionality behind these systems, we are missing the boat. So I just always will acknowledge and applaud that work. And his work and so many others really influenced my own learning. And so leaving, when I realized that Vera and that work still exists, and it is important because too many people are ensnared in our system, and we need power holders to hold that power differently. But what I tell you, for me, was a personal struggle is that, in my struggle with criminal justice reform more broadly, is that we're willing to try almost anything as long as it's low-level, nonviolent misdemeanor. And criminal justice reform doesn't create the space to do something different with violence. And that's the issue. Like, that is what we really have to tackle. And so what brought me to the organization that I am extremely blessed and privileged and proud to lead, and I'm so grateful for so much of my team who's here, Equal Justice USA, is because it's an organization that starts with violence and building and supporting community-based solutions to violence. And I just felt like, oh, wow, you're starting with the hardest thing, and you're starting outside of the system that isn't allowing us to do something different in the space. And so I shared my journey because part of what I hope people take away from this panel and from this conversation is the understanding, is that same journey I want others to take on. So I don't think that the answers to solving racial disparities in the system is to diversify the actors. We've done that. I don't think the answers are just to, try these different policy changes. We need to do this. Hear me clearly, because people are impacted. But if we're trying to solve the problem, we've got to think bigger. We've got to have more vision. We got to dream. And we've got to recognize that a system rooted in racial oppression that was established for the control and oppression of Black people is always going to produce the racial disparities that we see. It shouldn't surprise us. We should expect it. So that means we need solutions that are rooted in something other than the control and oppression of marginalized communities. We need to build up and support the solutions that are rooted in love, rooted in healing, rooted in repair. And so what excites me about what we've seen in this gathering and over the last 2 days is being in a place where we're seeing so much of this in action. I have been so energized and given so much hope by the different conversations we've had over these last 2 days, because these solutions are out here, but they're too few and too far between, and certainly not resourced enough. And so my hope is that we come out of this inspired to dream big, to build something else while we continue to tear down what's not working.
That's right.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Arva Rice, and I have the privilege of serving as president and CEO of the New York Urban League. The New York Urban League is one of 92 affiliates who are part of the National Urban League, who's one of the co-sponsors of the event today. Our Urban League focuses on education, employment, and advocacy. And in this role, I was invited to do a couple of different things, working on a commission with first Police Commissioner Bratton, then most recently when Governor Cuomo was wanting to reimagine the NYPD. Myself, Jennifer Jones-Austin of the Federation of Protestant Welfare Agencies, and Wes Moore, who at the time was at the Robin Hood Foundation, were asked to do a series of conversations with police officers, with community members, to talk about how to reimagine policing. It was some of the most difficult conversations that I've ever had, got cursed out in a church. had some difficult conversations with various members of the NYPD, and as a excuse me, as a reward for that work, excuse me, I was asked to join the Civilian Complaint Review Board. So the Civilian Complaint Review Board, for many of you may already know, is the New York City's largest oversight agency that looks at NYPD and those times and places when the police are engaged in various issues having to do with excessive force, abuse of authority, offensive language, or discourteous conduct. And so we are responsible for looking at those cases and making recommendations for discipline within the NYPD. And so that is some of the work that I am currently engaged in and why I was invited to be part of this incredible panel this afternoon. When I think about myths, I think the one that most of us are most familiar with is that whole idea notion that our communities are over-policed. And the fact is that we're over-surveilled, right? So there's constantly people who are looking and checking on us. But when it comes to actual safety and protection, that the fact is that we have the response that we get to calling 911 is less. The actual crimes that are solved is less. So I think that that's the most prevailing myth that most of the people around here and in this room already know about. I think when it comes specifically to the work of the Civilian Complaint Review Board, that a myth that exists is the fact that there's so many people who still don't know what we do. So we have community meetings. Every month we have a meeting. Some are at our offices, others we go out into the community. And every time we're at a community meeting, we have somebody raise their hand and say, like, what is this again? How do they talk to you? What are the things that are within your jurisdiction? So I think that that's one of the myths that perpetuate when it comes to Civilian Complaint Review Board. But when I was asked this question, I really started to think about the myths that are on the other side. What are the myths that the NYPD walks around with every day, right? Like, what are the things that they tell themselves that might be true? And it made me think about two conversations specifically that I've had. One was when I was doing that work with the governor's office, and one was as recently as yesterday. But I think that the first myth that the NYPD interacts with is when I was doing that work with the governor's office, I had a police officer say to me, you need to understand and recognize that we're never invited into the homes of the people that we're policing for Christmas dinner or for an anniversary party. We're always there at that point of contention and strife, right? And most of the time the police officers have is spent with other police officers. So the times that they interact with our communities are only at that times. And so what does that mean? And what does that mean for their interaction with me and with you? If they think that the times that define their interactions with the communities that they're policing are around those moments of strife. So that was one thing that kind of haunts me when I think about a myth within that the police department is walking around with. The second is, as I mentioned, a conversation that I had more recently. And I'll talk a little bit more about this as we go forward, but there's additional powers that have been given to our CCRB. And as a result of that, there's going to be a higher level of accountability, including the repeal of 50A. And I'm sure there's people in this room who are responsible for doing that advocacy and that work and that push in order to repeal 50A. And it's huge for our communities. But for the police officers, they're seeing that as now they're going to have a possible mark that will keep them from getting a job later on after they retire, right? So this effort, this energy, this push that these communities have put around accountability for a grouping of people feels like it's going to limit their job opportunities. And so that's what they're walking around with.
Arva, could you just quickly say what 50A is for those of us who may not be familiar?
I'm sorry. So 50A is a state law that allows for there to be more transparency around police misconduct. And so that means that they can log on to the CCRB website and actually look and see when police officers have had accusations that were put against them. And in the past, that was sealed. Nobody could ever see it. It was completely sealed from public view. So being able to have that available for individuals is huge.
Yeah, thank you. Just these takeaways are very you can ponder them, each one of them, for a while. I mean, think bigger, dream bigger. The myths that officers have about communities that they surveil, over surveil. The need to define this broadly and not just black-white. It's not just a black-white issue. And we know what this looks like, Khalil. We know what this looks like in different communities, in non-black Latino communities, in wealthy, well-to-do, middle-class communities. You just recently wrote a book, or is it a report, or is it a report that's long enough to be a book?
So the National Academies just released a report that I co-chair with Bruce Western.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in it, I mean, you look at trends, and you look at recent trends about the system and disparities in the system. Could you set the stage? I want to call you Professor Mohammed at this point, because this is kind of the learning, the real learning that we would get sitting in your classroom. But what are some of the takeaways that the report provides, and what has your research showed about disparities over the last 20 years or so?
Yeah, so first the report, Frankie and I were actually committee members. And so my job as co-chair and Bruce are really to bring together academics and practitioners who review the best and most recent research on a range of issues related to our charge. In this case, the National Academy's charge to us was to understand the causes of racial inequalities in the criminal justice system and what to do about them. So one of the, I think, important things, we do a number of things in the report, and Frankie, please jump in on this because it's important. One of the things we do is we expand the definition of racial inequalities to be more than just racial disparity. Because if we're stuck simply looking at whether or not there are differences, black, white, Latino, black, indigenous, white, you name it, then we miss the forest for the trees. So we need to understand that racial inequality captures much more than simply the numbers represented by these various systems. The second thing we do is we understand that the history of colonization, of settler colonialism, of chattel slavery, and ongoing and continuing acts of racial domination that impact non-white people, and forms of economic exploitation that impact everyone, including low-income white people, are not the distant past. But in order to understand the relationship of how that history informs our present, we need to name it in the report. And so rather than it being an abstraction, rather than it being a shout-out, there is some attention in the early part of the report to this issue. The third thing we do is we put a stake in the ground for the relationship between social policy and the criminal justice system in ways that generally do not happen in a report of this nature. If the primary focus of similar reports in the past has been various efforts at policing reform, the reducing, or I should say, the growth in incarceration causes and consequences report that came out in 2014, these reports have been important, but they have narrowed our focus to what is happening in the system and what needs to happen to change things in the system. But the truth is that no aspect of anything we've talked about today lives separate and apart from the larger social and structural climates that shape all of our lives. And so we decided early on in this report to make a big deal about that there is no aspect of this criminal legal system that will solve for racial inequality, whether it's being driven by the system itself or whether it is driven by outside forces, that doesn't turn on what we do in social policy. And by social policy, everything from housing to education to public health to mental health to early childhood education. We even talk about mortgage lending and discrimination in mortgage markets. We talk about the importance of greening and lighting. There are a range of possibilities that we want policymakers to make. Additionally, we talk about the fact that this system is dynamic and compounding, that generally speaking, researchers are focused on a particular aspect. Police researchers, corrections researchers, prosecutors, court research. But if we are to understand how this system actually functions, then we need to look at all of those systems in a dynamic process and recognize that, like whack-a-mole, any particular solution may not solve for the compounding effects that will occur down the road. And so, big takeaway, to reduce racial inequality in American society, in which case the footprint of the criminal legal system is huge, is to do less criminal legal system. Like, because up till now, most of National Academy reports started with the presumption that goodwill and good ideas would lead the criminal legal system to do a better job, better by whatever standard we know has been the standard over years. More efficiency, quote unquote, more fairness, more appropriate punitiveness for the bad people in our society, you name it. And it was a big deal, and Frankie backed me up on this, but it was a big deal for us to use the language of shrinking this system as a primary focus across multiple axes of engagement, from less policing to less pretrial detention to lower punishment for drug-related activity, eliminate the death penalty, get rid of technical violations. Now I'm talking about all the stuff within the system because I've already talked a bit about the broader themes. But less would equal more in terms of justice that we would want to see delivered. And then finally, because I'm still trying to solve for a 350-page report, is we spend a lot of time centering community at the heart of what we would expect to see in solving for problems, along the range of one, empowering community to have more political efficacy. So in my previous comments, I talked about there are political, what I call governors, and that is not elected officials, but brakes on how much punitiveness can be directed towards white communities. The same is not true for Black and brown communities and indigenous communities, largely driven by demographics within the communities, but also racial gerrymandering, and also, of course, the fact that every single criminal justice system we're talking about is state managed, meaning that state level politics, and there's no state in this country that is predominantly Black or brown, not yet. So the degree to which we have to empower communities to have more political efficacy in the things that they want to do goes hand in hand with everything from CBI, but also education, because we know that a community's voice can also be weaponized to unleash more punitiveness on that community. So we talk about heterogeneity, we talk about the need for more sophisticated survey tools to be able to point to what communities are actually asking for, rather than this kind of zero-sum game of more or less policing.
Frankie, if you want to add anything about your participation in the report, but I also want to, direct you to saying something like a policy solution seems so small in this context. And so a solution or solutions or a way of approaching this issue outside of the system, as we've been talking about, what's something that you can point to that you really want people to emphasize, whether it's communities or whether it's policy, like elected policymakers or so forth?
Sure. I'll just say when I first got out of law school, my Soros Justice Fellowship was to end direct file in California, and many people told me, like, you can spend your whole life doing this and you'll never accomplish it, and I kind of believed that because I didn't know anything. I didn't know what I didn't know. But what I did have was a strong organizing background, both as a college student but also as a gang-involved youth. And I did not like associating with older white lawyers. They weren't warm to me or accepting. As the brown kid, like, shoo, go away, we got this kind of a sentiment, which they didn't. So I just gravitated towards the hoods of, throughout California, again, Black, brown, API communities all over the state, and educated folks on law and policy. And my narratives were always more inclusive, because I understood from, as I mentioned before, this is not simply a Black issue versus a white issue. Even my own community would say, like, well, we're not that effective. And I would show them or point out examples, and over a conversation, they would change their mind. But it's just like we are conditioned to believe the stuff that we see during the first 8 minutes of any news segment. And so what I would say is going into communities and talking to people and asking questions and listening more than we're talking, to help understand what it is that folks should know. And so my approach has never been to convince people, but rather to understand what it is that they think and why. And only that way am I able to shift the narrative. And over time, it was really about self-determination, giving them the tools to do the things that I alone can never do. And I would say collectively in our statewide coalition in California, it's very diverse. There is no, one group over the other. We're all equally contributing and affected, but it's been very effective because I think everybody has a shared interest. And over time, we've been repealing and repealing. And I'll just say another thing is beyond the changing the narrative to be more inclusive, is also this idea that the only way to achieve true safety is through health. You cannot have public safety without public health, because healthy communities do not hurt each other. Whether you're talking about young children who understand their identity, who understand culture, and the people that police them who have control over their lives, to be able to understand and appreciate them and see themselves in one another has been necessary. And so, I know that your question kind of shifted, but for me, it's always been about trying to be on the ground with folks, understand from them, and speak to them as opposed to at them. And otherwise, they just kind of check out. And if they don't see themselves as being affected by that problem, some of them get resentful because they do understand, like, we're affected too and no one's speaking to our issue, or they just believe the lie that it doesn't affect them. And I think that we need to do better with our platforms to help people understand that this does affect them. And somebody said, less criminal justice system. Stop deferring to the warden on issues of education, or why do we defer unnecessarily, I think, to police when we have experts who are experts at medicine and youth development and public safety and public health. We need to do a better job of centering these folks as credible, as viable, more so than the person who spent, not to diss the military, but like they teach you one thing, but they don't teach you how to run an effective school or an effective hospital or an effective, society. So.
Yeah, less criminal justice system, shrink the system, smaller, grow and invest on the outside to address. I mean, we've talked about root causes in this space for such a long time, and the investments have not come with it. So, Jami, you talked about working outside. I mean, you worked in the system for a while. You worked to help shape the system and reform the system, but now you're working to build solutions. And my vocabulary is really failing me. Something besides solutions. If you want to shout it out, this is an interactive. Solutions that are working, that are outside of the system, that is community built and led. Tell us a little bit more about that and some of the things that you really want to point out of what you see as, the things that need to be established, the core things that need to be established in your work.
Yeah. I think that actually that gives me a good opportunity to address what I forgot to address the first round, which was the misconception that I think is the biggest problem for the general public. And I want to be clear, it's not a misconception in this room. We are the choir, right? But the misconception that the general public has, which is that racial disparities exist in the system because Black, brown, marginalized communities are more dangerous. They are the problem. And I think when we can flip that on its head, and when we look at a situation, for instance, like Jordan Neely and what happened to him on the New York City subway, and instead of looking at what he did, which was essentially shouting, asking for help, naming needs, thirst, hunger, being frustrated, when we can look at that situation and stop pointing at, well, he had a mental health issue, it was his thing, as our issue as a society and how we've failed. It was D.A. Gonzalez who said this, I'll never forget this. The shift for him was when he would look at a criminal history report as a lead prosecutor and not see the failures of the person, but the failures of the system. So we've seen you over and over and over. You've got 30 contacts with the system, and we still have not gotten this right. It's not their failure, it's our failure. So if we can flip that on its head and we own, then I think that will motivate us to understand that less punishment is not the answer. And I want to acknowledge, like, what a big deal it is that the National Academies of Science would issue a report. To me, that's a huge step in that direction. It is us owning that we're making this worse, and this is not an individual issue, it's a societal issue, and we have to do something different. And so to your question about, so what is working, to me, the things that give me the most hope are the things that we have the privilege to support in our organization, which are essentially going to the folks who have been most impacted by violence, who know most deeply what the problems are, and who know and have been living the solutions. Communities have been taking care of themselves for a very long time, particularly marginalized communities. We know that from data that tells us when violent crimes happen, that 50% aren't even reported. People are dealing with them in their own neighborhoods, but they're dealing with them, and I think who really stood out to me in these last couple of days was Sam Vaughn. If any folks were in the panel yesterday, talking about the specific work happening in Richmond around targeting shooters and the incredible result they've seen on bringing down shootings during the period of his work. But what stood out to me was essentially what was at the root of that work was love, was that they become the family. Because, and I talk about this anytime anybody will listen to me, and I think anyone who's been adjacent to the system agrees with this, there's no one who has caused harm who themselves weren't a victim first. This is why this idea of folks who are incarcerated, this came up in the main panel with Aswad and others, that there isn't a separation. They were victims before they were offenders or people who caused harm. And even as it was Sarita describing how she testified before that legislature and what they throw up in her face as her conviction, no, they first should have seen her as a survivor of violence. But that's not the label they gave her. Now it was the label they gave the white woman who went in, hold your head up, you can do this. So when we can give marginalized communities that same grace, and the folks who are more willing to give that grace, unfortunately, are usually the folks who look like us. We are more willing to see the humanity, see the potential, and not just see the harm. So our work is really just going, throughout the country, work most specifically in Newark and Baton Rouge. If you want some great examples of what's happening in Newark, and I know some of this was touched on by Mayor Baraka, but there's an incredible report sitting on that table over there that really documents the more than 20 community-based organizations who are leading the work in Newark. It is at a 60-year low in homicides right now. In a time in this country where almost every jurisdiction is experiencing an increase, that has come from sustained community engagement, going to the people who know the problems, empowering them, resourcing them, and giving them the capacity to do what they were already doing just underneath. So I would say see the report for some concrete examples, and I'll stop there. I've gone on too long.
No, the EJUSA staff is prepared too with the reports. There it is. Hold it up high there. Hold it up high. It's over on. There it is. Yeah. One thing that resonates with what you're saying and what others have been saying as well is, it's been going on for 15 years in Newark Plus, or however long. In Richmond, it's been going. And we were talking earlier about the leash, for lack of a better word, that law enforcement is given, that police solutions are given, and somebody mentioned it's not even a leash. It's like whatever happens, it's always funded, it's always going up, it's always the same thing. But for these types of other programs, for community-based, community-led solutions, it's such a come up with a RCT immediately and come up with a study and show your results immediately, or else the funding's going to go away, or else the political support's going to go away. Really, really great. Arvi, you're working in a subfield here in policing that, let's just say it's difficult, and let's just say you have a lot going against you, or a lot that you're going up against. Talk to us about the things that you're looking at in your CCRB work that does, kind of give you maybe hope or maybe some optimistic look at shrinking the system or accountability and how to keep government actors in check.
Well, I think that I'm hopeful because of the work that you're talking about, the work that you were describing. When I was asked to be part of that governor's task force, we were specifically supposed to reimagine NYPD policing, and we refused to just look at that, right? So we started to talk about looking at decriminalization of poverty, looking at this history of policing, and making sure that that was part of the report, and making sure that that was part of the conversation. Because we know that as much as we can talk about accountability, and I can give specific examples of that and the ways in which we can strengthen that, that we did have to take that comprehensive perspective. And the fact is that, you know, the system that we have that's oppressing Black people was designed to do that. So the system is doing exactly what it was designed to do, right? So we can talk about tinkering, but we need to also talk about reimagining. And that reimagining has to not only be of policing, but of all the other systems that contribute to the ways in which we are oppressed as a community. And so that was the reason why it was important for us to focus on all those perspectives. But when it comes to accountability, the Civilian Complaint Review Board has specific ways in which we think that we can be more effective. The fact is that all the recommendations that we make around discipline are then given to the police commissioner, and the police commissioner ultimately decides whether to implement that discipline or not. So we have the police policing themselves, right? And so to the degree to which we're only going to have a certain level of accountability as long as that mechanism is in place. There are certain things that are specific that can strengthen our work as well. We have access to body-worn camera footage as a result of the great work of, at that time, city council member, then public advocate, and now Attorney General Letitia James, who worked really hard in order to push for the body-worn camera footage. And so us being able to have access to it is incredible and is very helpful in our work, but being able to get that, have more immediate access to that would also be helpful to us as well. And then we have there's ceiling statutes that are also in place. So we're not able to look at specific cases and have to go to court in order to get the judge to agree to open up those ceiling statutes in order for us to be able to use that in our litigation work. And so that slows down the wheels of justice. Even the work that we can do is slowed down by that. So there are things that we know that we can do in order to make the CCRB most effective. But I think that it's important for every city to be able to have a CCRB at all, because I know that there's so many communities that don't have that. So to be able to put it into place and then be able to put in all the mechanisms in order that it's not only recommendations, but that they're discipline that can actually be impacted within those communities.
Thanks, Sarah. We started a little bit late, but I want to make sure that I keep my promise to you all to make this a discussion. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. There's a question right here up front. And if you could speak loudly, because we are recording this, and I'll try to come to each, I'll be the, no, it's okay. I'll play two roles here. So please, if you want to just ask your question.
Hi, good afternoon. So I approach this work from not criminal justice mind, but an environmental justice mind. And I appreciate the information that you're sharing and the efforts that you have taken to, shift our minds in the way we think about criminal justice, but also attack those issues. Just as you mentioned that basically we need to start shifting away from criminal justice. Just as in environmental justice, we're moving away from fossil fuels and we're moving into solar energy. We can do the same thing in the criminal justice space. But I think we need to be thinking bigger in terms of just policing and we need to be thinking bigger. So what I mean by that is that we need to be looking at what more root causes as to why things are happening. So I work in water justice, and one of the things I've been studying is lead and how lead actually affects the body and the brain, right? Mayor Chokwe talked about how young people are committing crimes in Mississippi and Jackson at a higher rate than before. If we look at what lead does to the brain and what it does over time, we have to know that there is an association to crime and violent crime. In fact, it's actually proven. There's data to prove that. Also, in the foods that we're eating, right? We need to be looking at the processed foods and what they do to our bodies. There have been countries that have been banning foods that we accept here in America. I can tell you that the spinach that I used to eat before it doesn't have the same nutrients as the spinach that I'm eating now. In fact, it's less, right? And so we have to get our nutrients from the supplements that we're taking. But is everyone doing that? And are we looking at those sort of like what lead is doing to the body? Are we looking at what food does to the body, as opposed to just looking at one sort of, you know, coming from one angle?
Thank you. Any response to that question?
I'll just say briefly that our report does point to the environmental racism that creates the toxic conditions and structural realities that can create an environment where crime is more likely to happen. And we actually do point to the work of community gardens as part of a larger strategy of investing in communities, often led by community workers and or community leaders who are committed to better food and more green space in those communities.
The only thing I'll add real quick is that also by doing less of the criminal legal response creates the room for more of everything else, you know. So when we're not spending the majority of our budgets, which is the case in most jurisdictions on police, prosecution, and prisons, then we can actually fix the lead pipes and do those things that need to be done.
Hi, good afternoon. Rashid Thomas with the New York Urban League and a consultant. What are your thoughts about states using prison labor?
I mean, the short version of this, and I'm borrowing Ruth Gilmore, who wrote Golden Gulag, is that, and maybe the numbers changed a little bit, but 92% of people experiencing incarceration are experiencing publicly funded, publicly run, publicly managed punishment. So while it's important to recognize the perverse incentives for CCC and other privately traded companies that these days do a lot of work in the detention crimmigration system, it's a small piece of the puzzle of the prison industrial complex. Most of this, I mean, another way to reimagine the question is to say, why do we continue to use the punishment system as a public works jobs program for overwhelmingly white people and to some degree working class Black and Latino people who help to manage the problem of organized austerity and divestment and the collateral consequences that come with that.
So first and foremost, thank you so much for the insightful dialogue. I recently read The Condemnation of Blackness, and it talked about the role of race in America and some of the outcomes and experiences we face today and how things have built in that trajectory of focusing on race as a tool to marginalize and criminalize people of color. I'm wondering your insights around race as a factor and class as a factor as it pertains to incarceration.
Okay, Frankie, please. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I'll just say, I think, I started with this. I know that you came late, but I think, from the beginning, race was constructed obviously for hierarchies, and when you think about, first of all, race didn't start at 1619 or even 1492. It started way before, with the campaigns against the Moors. It was racialized violence, Europeans against people in the Middle East and in Africa. You could argue also that ethnic violence was waged against the Irish Catholic, with the Scots and the Protestants and all that. And by the time they got to this continent, they had, in some ways, already very advanced racial hierarchies and racial violence, and with Native folks, right? There was no place for them. In order to create this myth, this narrative that this was a barren land, manifest destiny had to to have any kind of seeming truth to it. They had to erase Native folks, create Latinos, create African Americans, and just divide everybody as much as possible. And in the end, that is still true. Like, we cannot have the people who are in power continue to have that power if we're all divided by race. And so I just think it is both a product, a consequence, but it's also the thing that is necessary for settler colonialism to succeed. They needed to eradicate the native folks for their land and exponentially grow black folks for the labor so that they can, you know, sip tea from the porch and watch the profits come in. And now it's the prison stuff. You know, so I don't know what we do with that because we're so far gone, and I think that it's such a complicated issue. How do you begin to undo the race and the consequence of being racist? Even thinking about the census and how I identify, like, not being identified has a consequence, then we're undercounted. But, you know, if I want to be identified as so-called Latino, I got to go through the white track, and I'm like, I refuse to do that shit, so I'm Native American then, you know, and you know, maybe they have feelings about it, but I'm just like, there's nothing there for me. And so I just think this idea of race is just construed. It wasn't, you know, it served a purpose. I think now it doesn't make sense for a lot of folks. You know, we still don't capture a lot of folks like from the Middle East. Some of them have to be white. We don't capture a lot of folks, and you know, so I think race is complicated. It doesn't make sense. It's something I just feel like, man, I don't even want to engage in that conversation because I'm not trying to make sense of some dumb idea that somebody else made that I don't really identify with.
Any other questions? Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
I actually probably don't need the mic. Just two things. Both Khalil and Arva, you alluded to two important studies, but I want you to lift up how we can get those studies, right? And Frankie, I want you to appreciate how much somebody like me, somebody who survived the streets of the Soprano state, to see somebody like you survive what you survive and then go through law school and be a change maker. So we're very proud of you. We really want to lift that up. We really want to lift that up. Right? And Arva, you know, we just heard Mayor Baraka talk about his community-based violence ecosystem, but we also rumbling like hell with our police, so they behave. And we have the only civilian review board in the state of New Jersey, and we're fighting for it to have some of the teeth that you're talking about, that you're dealing with on the inside. So I want to make sure that we connect, so there's some places for the community engagement work that's very good that the CCRB does in New York, can help other fights for CCRB in places like Newark and other states. I just wanted to lift all of you up in that way.
Thank you.
I want to, you know, close our conversation by asking one of the questions here about where we are as a country in this conversation. So a lot of these conversations and knowledge has been in our communities for years, decades, and so forth. It's only come to the national level very recently. And, you know, let's just say it was like 10, 12 years ago that people started talking more about race in a national conversation. Fast forward to our conversation now, and, you know, we talk about the recent incidents, you know, where, you know, there's a killing of a man on the subway, and there's a defense that comes with it when people are pointing out the racial dynamics of that incident, or any incident across the country, whether it's a mass shooting in Texas, you know, where there is like Nazi emblems emblazoned on somebody's body who shot and killed, you know, 8, 9 people, a lot of them children, and the conversation goes to, well, it's a false flag operation, and so this is kind of the dynamic of the world that we're in. I don't use this term lightly, but the craziness that we're in when it comes to our national conversation on race. And so I want to close the conversation by asking each of you, as you do your work, how do you approach this in different settings? I mean, Arva, I'm going to start off with you, because you're sitting in a situation where you're talking about, you know, this is a conversation about race, disparities, inequality when it comes to policing. So how do you approach that conversation? And I think these are some of the things that I want to, you know, learn from, and I think folks in the audience will as well.
If you don't mind, I want to pivot back to my other role, which is the CEO of the New York Urban League, right? So that's what I actually get a paycheck for. So after George Floyd was killed, I started to. We were, you know, remember we're deep in COVID, and so at the time I was, you know, trying to get back to work, but still at home, and so I'd be sitting on my couch, and my phone would ring, and people would, and I was getting phone calls. It was just like, "Hi, are you Arva Rice? Yes, I am. You're the head of the Urban League? Yes. I heard you're black. Yes, I am. You work with black people? Yes, I do. Okay, so we want to build a partnership with you because you're black and you work with black people. Like literally, like just getting these random phone calls from people who are just like trying to connect with something black, right? And so we started to do and have all these conversations with individuals. And I was thinking about it when you asked the question about the intersection of being black, race, and also of class. And I remember having a conversation with a particular sports franchise, which I won't mention, but they were in the Bronx and they were pinstripes. And they called, and they'd been a long-term partner of ours, and they've actually done really good work with us. But their work was always about giving to the Urban League, so you could give scholarships or you could do this. So it was always external. And so it was the first time that franchise looked around and said, wait a minute, most of the people who are working here don't look anything like our players, don't look anything even like the people who come to our games. So what can we do in order to be more reflexive of that? And my apologies for this long response. But so we started to do a series of conversations with them and talking to them about disparities and underscoring it. And I remember having to figure out a way in order to kind of bring down that initial kind of I'm not racist, right? So how could I enter that conversation? And so I told them this one story, which I'll tell very quickly, and that is, so I live in Harlem, and I'm walking down the street towards my brownstone, and I look and I see somebody who's like laid out in front of the brownstone, and police officers are standing over him. And so I'm looking like, oh no, what's going on? And I'm walking, and I looked and I noticed his tennis shoes. And I was like, oh my gosh, my brother-in-law would love those tennis shoes. Like he's like, loves Michael Jordan and blah, blah, his Nikes, blah. And I'm walking, I'm like, wait a minute, that is my brother-in-law. And so my brother-in-law is laid out in front of this brownstone, and the police are standing over him, and I walk up, and my immediate response is, excuse me, what are you doing? That is my brother-in-law, right? And in that moment, it was both race but also class, right? Because me, as the black woman CEO of the Urban League who owned the brownstone, came up on the police officers like, what are you doing, right? But I could do that because of the place and space that I hold in the world, right? But then there's my brother-in-law, who in that moment, with his tennis shoes on and the way he was dressed, looked like any other brother walking down the street, right? So the issues of race and class are so connected, but being able to enter that conversation with that sports franchise team, recognizing I am privileged. I have a college degree. I have two parents. I grew up in a two-parent household. I was the first person to go to college in my family, but still, I'm privileged, right? And so being able to have that conversation, being honest about the place and space that I own in this world, but also knowing that if I wake up in the middle of the night in my sweats and go to the emergency room, I'm going to be treated just like Shaquita and everybody else, right? So that's part of the ways in which I have to interact around race and class.
Johnny?
I think the answer is that the problems are so big, they're never going to be solved in silos. And so another thing I love about our work, and I can't help it, is one of our core values is transcending divides. And so we have intentional outreach work that is targeting conservatives, intentional outreach work targeting evangelicals. And in order to make the changes we need to see, it can't just be the folks bearing the brunt of the problems who have to fix it. It needs all of us. And the thing is, that work is working. That work grew out of, again, ending like our anti-death penalty work. So when you can stop the state violence, again, it creates the space to do something different. You don't end the death penalty in any state without a bipartisan bill. And so growing out of that work now, we are bringing our conservative friends along to embrace our fuller mission. And so we just took a group of conservatives down to Montgomery to experience the National Museum and Memorial. And that trip went, we weren't sure what to expect, right? But the report back from the team is it went so much better than expected. We're excited about the opportunities. Like, at the end of the day, people are people, and yeah, we've been, we are all, we live in a world full of white supremacy, so we're all subject to that thinking. But we also know some folks are raised in certain families where they are taught certain things, and until they have the chance to learn something different, learn our history, go to a place where they can see really clearly the direct links, then at the end of the day, they're people, and believe in, just that we have more in common than what separates us. And to your question in the back, it's what gives me hope about, like, Reverend Barber's Poor People's Campaign, right? Like, that is that is about class. It is not about, it is an umbrella. We all need to be in this fight. Let's come together. And I think that's the kind of work it's going to take.
Frankie?
I'll just say, my approach to my work has definitely evolved and matured over the years. And when I first started working on any direct file, I was very conscious that I was speaking to white men with a lot of power, many of them egotistical, many of them sociopaths, and was really conscious and also be my authentic self. But really not trying to trigger their ego or their emotion, right? So even though I know I'm lying, I'm like, they lie every day. And I would start off with, you're doing a good job, but you could do better. And try to find ways to help them do things that are actually gonna have an impact. And over time, I just learned some people are all about, a pound of flesh. Some people are gonna be about the money, especially the legislature. How much is this saving? And having different narratives for different people. If you're talking to a libertarian, it's about like, big government is abusing little individual families and what resonates. And over time, I'm just, when I started, California was prosecuting 1,000 kids a year as adults. And because of our collective reform work, we've been prosecuting less. It was like 58, 27, and 25 in the last 3 years for the whole state. And I've really been now focused on diversion and prevention and early interventions. But for that, we need money. And then you always get the whole, whether they say it or not, like this is charity for black and brown people. And I say, do yourself a favor and don't make problems where we don't need those problems. And so I've been successful in moving budget bills. In the last few years that I worked on them, we moved almost $60 million for pre-arrest diversion programs in California, and I wrote in the legislation for non-government, non-law enforcement entities. This can only go to CBOs, and they must be in the communities where this stuff is happening. So only communities have above average rates of incarceration or racial disparities can get this money, and it's for also culturally rooted, pro-social, academic, labor apprenticeships, things like that. And using the data to show this is a good investment. For every $1 you invest, you yield X amount, and it changes. But that's the stuff that to some people who don't care about racial justice care about. Some people don't care about science. They care about the bottom line. And so just being okay with that, because I can't go into a community of color and bring up the money argument. I mean, it's like, who fucking cares about money? Well, some people do, and I need to be equipped with that stuff. And they move. And to date, we've had 2 3-year cohorts come through this. We've served more than 15,000 diverted youth. We have a 70% success rate with only 68% that were rearrested after being diverted in these programs. And again, it's about self-determination, letting these communities choose for themselves who they want to serve, how they're going to serve, and giving them the money and staying out of the way and not calling it charity. It ain't fucking charity. It's like us doing ourselves a favor and not creating more problems by letting police. And police will also say, I don't want to be taking this kid to probation. They do nothing. It's a revolving door. And if given the opportunity or that choice, I would take them somewhere else. And they do. So, I mean, I'll just say, that's how I approach it. Thank you.
Yeah. I love being able to have different conversations with different people, maintain your authentic self. Really, really appreciate that. Professor, you have the last word.
I was looking for this quote, and I just about got to it, so I'll share it in just a moment. I've been doing some version of this performance for about 25 years. I've sort of been studying the criminal justice system since the late 1990s as a graduate student. And a lot has changed. A tremendous amount has changed. I mean, we use the word race here a lot when we really mean racism. And so race has been a euphemism, which, for me, 15 years ago, often really was coded as the problem of black pathology or brown pathology, the problem of what those people are doing, as opposed to systems and structures. So I'm always conscious today, to be clear. I mean, I wrote a book with the subtitle Race, Crime in the Making of Modern Urban America, not Racism, Crime in the Making. I wish I knew better then. I know better now. So language has gotten more precise in naming the problem. The public health community is really good at this. Race isn't what leads to premature death. Racism is, in terms of access, in terms of the food deserts, you name it, to come back to your earlier point. I also want to say, over the last 15 years, particularly, and not quite, but since I've been in this city, first at the Schomburg and then continuing in my work here, a lot of nonprofit work that is headquartered here in the city. I remember coming to John Jay for the first time, not actually as the first time to visit, but the first time to teach a class. I taught on one particular day. I taught in an undergraduate class and I taught in a graduate class. And both classes happened to be led by faculty who were teaching mostly police officers. So the student population in those classrooms was overwhelmingly cops. I gave basically the same mini lecture on condemnation of blackness. And in both classes, one undergrad, one graduate class, the overwhelming population of police officers of color were very defensive that they were, and I'm going to quote basically one of them, but the spirit and the tone was similar everywhere. They had joined the NYPD to clean up their communities and catch the perps in their community. And it struck me as very powerful because here, in the context of what, was about education and professionalization for these particular police officers, they had a very simplistic, crass notion of how the world works. They're good people and they're bad people, and my job is to catch the bad guys because that's how I'm going to make my community better. And so nothing, and this was after I had already spoken. So it did not sink in. And I worry that the time from then till now has seen, in some ways, a lot of change, but not enough. And I think that we have to be even more clear in conversations. I appreciate Jami talking about reaching out to white communities of conservatives and evangelicals, but I think we don't focus enough in our own families. A lot of white people had to count for the Trumpers in their own family. I had one in mind, a black woman who was a Trumper. But I don't think we are spending enough time talking to our own relatives about why more policing is not going to save us in this system, in spite of the carjackings and the subways, and you name it, no matter where you are in this country. Because this system doesn't work in today's age. It worked 50 years ago. It doesn't work today without black and brown jailers. It just doesn't work. And you're going to see even more of them. I'm a free, tenured, privileged professor, so I can say what I want to say, but my guess is that aside from the 30% of black and brown New Yorkers who are actually punitive and law and order types, which is real, the silent majority of black voters who were swayed by Eric Adams' tough on crime messaging maps onto a white population of actual New Yorkers who would want an Eric Adams to follow a Bill de Blasio to make possible the kind of veneer of non-racist police action tough on crime. We have to keep up with these people because the presentation of black and brown people standing as the gatekeepers and guardians of racial capitalism is going to become even more significant in the years, not decades, in the years to come. Trump got 50% more black voters in 2020 than he got in 2016, particularly black men. We can't forget this. And the organizing, the Herschel Walker thing is not like a fucking joke. They will reach down to the lowest depths of the abyss. And the thing is, if the people in this room aren't having those conversations with your cousin in Athens, Georgia, about what is happening, then we have to bear some responsibility for having this conversation amongst ourselves and writing our papers and being on the national academies and this and that, when that's where the front line of the work is. It really is about the education that is required to get people to understand how this works. So I'm going to close with this quote from the great literary critic and novelist. His name is Albert Murray. And Albert Murray wrote a book in 1970 called The Omni-Americans. Simple thesis that because of the unique conditions of black life in America, they were the most American of all. And Nicole Hannah-Jones makes a similar argument in 1619 Project. He says, the social science statistical survey is the most elaborate fraud in modern times. African Americans should never forget that the group in power is always likely to use every means at its disposal to create the impression that it deserves to be where it is. And it is not above suggesting that those who have been excluded have only themselves to blame. So we have the voices, we have the work. Everything Frankie has shared is just spectacular. We've got to organize in our own families, in our own communities. We have to share the good news of what's happening in Newark, because that's the difference between saving lives and building a better future for all of us, and taking some personal pride in our own individual agency, because that's not going to get us there.
Please join me in thanking these panelists.